Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Talk to OBN show, our weekly program. In fact, we are on the final week of 2012 and 2013 is going to be embarked after 4 days. In our today's program, we are going to have a quick recap on our production that we have made over the past couple of months. Among others, we have made a production on major agendas and issues in Ethiopia. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, about COVID-19 global pandemic, the economic, the socio-political impact of COVID, the holistic phenomenon of COVID in Ethiopia, about Amnesty International report, casualties and unrests in Ethiopia. We have also made a production on humanitarian activities in Ethiopia. We have also made a production on technological innovations and technological transformation in Ethiopia. How was your stay in Cairo? Because these days the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has got a kind of controversy between Egypt and Ethiopia, right? What is the reaction of Egyptians there?
Well, as an ambassador, as a diplomat, you are posted to a given position to promote your national interest. In Cairo, well, our national interest is basically strengthening relationship or improving relationship with the host country, creating understanding on the current issues that we have differences on, issues of GERD. And over 1 year, in my 1 year stay, I have been moving around and I've been trying to meet various officials from the host country and diplomats based there and heads of international organizations. Basically, it was about, I was meeting them to inform them, to brief them on what Ethiopia intends to do with the GERD. I was trying to explain to them the fact that Ethiopia is not interested in hurting anyone. Ethiopia is only interested in developing itself, it's developing its natural resource, and in acquiring electricity, which is very much lacking in the country. These are some of the things that I used to brief them.
How do you explain the Nile hydropolitics?
Well, Nile is a large and a long river. This is actually the longest river in the world. So there are 11 countries that share the Nile waters. Some of them are countries that are that give water to downstream countries, and some of them are downstream countries that receive the water resources of the Nile. So the hydropolitics of the Nile is it is the competition and it is a political negotiation, and it is a national interest over the use and control of the Nile water, basically. But now the actual hydropolitics of the Nile has been characterized by the downstream countries who want to use the totality of the water resources, and the upstream countries who want to also use their water resources for their own national development in their own countries. So these two different interests, the control and monopolization interest of the downstream countries, especially Egypt, and the interest of upstream countries that also want to use their water resources for their own development. That makes the basic feature of the hydropolitics of the Nile waters.
About 85% of the water source of Nile originates from Ethiopia. And this river stretches throughout 11 countries. Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia takes the major stake. Ethiopia is the source of the water, as it's all known. Egypt and Sudan got their own claim on the Nile River. What are those grounds to inquire such questions?
85+% of the flow comes from Ethiopia, but in terms of utilization, the Nile has been an exclusive monopoly of Egypt and Sudan. The issue of the Nile is far more important as between Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt, but the riparian countries are 11, like you said. That's so because it's an anomalous reality in the Nile, where the source of the waters, Ethiopia, which contributes 85% plus, makes absolutely no use, while the lower riparians, Egypt and Sudan, which make no contribution at all to the flow, are currently using the entirety of the flow, and they are hell-bent on making sure that this would remain forever. So that's why Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt are the main stakeholders in terms of utilization of the Nile water resources, but there are other 8 riparian countries who are entitled to and make a claim to the water resource as well.
Magdalene, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, as the doctor said, there are 11 countries which we need to consider, and this talking about the Nile use in terms of a subset of countries is actually a dangerous narrative, which is what got us here in the first place. As a transboundary water course, all the riparian countries have a fair and equitable share in the use of the water, and they're entitled to their fair share according to a reasonable and equitable utilization. That we don't have in the Nile Basin, and because of colonial era treaties which were made in the past, which basically allocated the whole of the Nile waters between these 2 countries. These countries, Egypt and Sudan in particular, seem to have historical claims and seem to have a larger stake in the water, but as far as being fair in international law and equitable transboundary use is concerned, all the 11 riparian countries have a fair share and an equal say as far as their claims in the Niles are concerned. So framing Nile water use in terms of a subset of countries is actually a very dangerous narrative, which we need to move away from. When we talk about the Nile, we have to talk in terms of the basin as a whole, including all the 11 countries. Because of the GERD, because of the dam that we're building, the conversation around the Nile is focusing on the 3 countries, because these 3 countries are actually the ones who are highly engaged in the discussion on the GERD. But as far as Nile water use is concerned, all 11 countries have equal stake and equal equitable share in the Nile water use.
Doctor, most of the time Egypt asserts a historical claim over the Nile River. Does that work out today?
Yeah. Just to add one important point of the danger of looking at the Nile through the prism of the GERD is a very dangerous approach, because when we speak about the transboundary water courses and the right of riparian countries, we are speaking about legal rights to a basin. We are not speaking about one project, Project X, Project Y, Project Z. That's not the way. And not addressing the issue of water utilization in the perspective of a basin-wide approach, or at least a sub-basin approach, and reducing the whole process to a project-by-project deal is a recipe for disaster. That's one strategic mistake Ethiopia as a country made by engaging in a project-specific deal in the absence of an overarching legal institutional framework to address the issue of utilization and preservation of the resource. Coming back to the issue of historical rights, one thing that must be clear out from the outset is in international water law, there's no concept of historical rights. There's only a right to an equitable and reasonable utilization of a shared water resource by every riparian country, irrespective of your geographic position upstream, midstream or downstream, or irrespective of any other extraneous considerations like contribution, dependence, length of use. All these are factors to be taken into account. They don't determine the right. The right is anchored in the fact of being a sovereign riparian country. So the implication is you cannot have any better right by exercising it for thousands of years and and not an iota of your rights would be reduced by not using it for thousands and thousands of years. So it's pegged with the fact of being a sovereign riparian country. Therefore, the claim to a historical right, sometimes they call it acquired rights. They give it different names, and it's all a pretext to justify, to legitimize an iniquitous reality where the country making most of the contributions makes no use of the water resource, and those downstream countries which make no contribution to the flow use the entirety. So it's throwing up different terms and then phrases to justify and give a legitimate clock to an inequitable reality which cannot stand in the face of law. So like I said, the rule is equitable and reasonable utilization as a right to all riparian countries.
Magdalite,
Yes.
to add some, Egyptians most of the time stick to this colonial treaty, right? Because it favors their benefit. What are the major shortcomings of the colonial treaty?
Well, for starters, you can't have, as I said earlier, you can't have basin-wide allocation between two countries, where we have 11 countries to share the water with. So that's the first major drawback. It's not inclusive. It was done exclusively between Egypt and Sudan, if we're considering the 1959 agreement, and the UK and Egypt, if we're considering the 1929 agreement. So that in itself is a major drawback. It's not inclusive. Where we have 11 countries, these dealings were done between two countries. And the second one is, it is clearly unequitable and unfair. There is no arrangement where, if it was done right, that Egypt would get 66% of the Nile water, Sudan would get 22% of the Nile water, and all the other riparian countries would get 0% of the Nile water. So major drawbacks being one, it was uninclusive, and two, it's clearly unequitable. Under any set of circumstances, if we were to apply equitable and reasonable use in the Nile, and as Doctor mentioned earlier, there are factors to consider. So how much of your population depends on it, how much of the basin is in your country, how much of the water you contribute to existing and potential uses of your country, which is dependent on the Nile water. There are a set of factors which are outlined in the UN 1997 Shared Water Use Convention, and also in the Cooperative Framework Agreement. So there are factors which the international community agrees upon, which should be considered in determining equitable and reasonable use. If we were to apply those factors in the Nile Basin, there is no arrangement that would actually result in Egypt and Sudan using their current share, like their claimed share of the Nile waters, which is why they cling to it, because they know for a fact that no other arrangement will result in that kind of skewed sharing between shared use of the Nile waters. So the reason they cling to these colonial agreements is because it gives them an unfair advantage, an unfair use, an unfair claim on the Nile waters. But that's clearly, that's exactly the drawback of these agreements. They were not inclusive and they were not fair. So they don't stand in the face of international law, modern customary laws, and just basic rational, decent allocation. None of it makes sense. None of it makes sense. So yeah, the major drawbacks being these two ones.
Doctor, do you have any?
Yeah, the discussion about colonial treaties and their relevance is one murky area where there is so much misunderstanding. When we speak about colonial treaties in the context of the Nile waters, we are primarily referring to the 1929 agreement. It was an agreement entered into between Britain, representing its colonies, and Egypt. So one thing that must be clear is that if there is ever any relevance of that treaty in the sense of its continued application, that absolutely doesn't concern Ethiopia. We never were British colonies, so it's a non-issue for us. So Ethiopia has nothing to do with the 1929 Nile agreement. But even then, for the former British colonies, is there any legal possibility whereby the extremely inequitable provisions of the 1929 agreement would still be binding on the independent Nile riparian countries? That's a clear issue of law, and international law is very clear on this. Upon their independence, countries decide which of their past treaties concluded on their behalf by the predecessor state they want to be bound by. And none of the former British colonies accepted the 1929. Not even Sudan itself accepted it. It challenged the 1929. So there is no, well, the narrative is made to give the impression that the existing inequitable allocation reality in the Nile Basin is somehow founded on some form of law, and there is absolutely no legal foundation for the reality. The second treaty is the 1959 treaty. So what they did is divided the entire flow between Egypt and Sudan in the 1929 agreement. The utilizable volume was 52 billion, 48 was determined to be Egypt's share, and 4 billion cubic meter was determined to be Sudan's share. They call it their historical right. It's not a legal concept, but it's a reference to indicate how this calculation of share was reached at. And the calculation was based on the assumption that they are entitled to what they have been practically using until the date of the treaty. Okay, so how much you have been using, that is considered to be historically your share. It doesn't have any legal significance. It doesn't extend to the rights of other riparian countries. So then the second agreement between, it's not a colonial treaty, it's the first Nile Basin treaty between two independent riparian countries, the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. What was left undivided and unutilized of the entire flow of the Nile was to be entirely allocated and used. That's evident in the designation of the treaty itself, 1959 treaty, for the full utilization. So the entirety of the flow is now allocated between Egypt and Sudan. 84 billion cubic meters is said to be the annual flow. 55.5 billion is for Egypt, 18.5 billion cubic meter is for Sudan, and 10 billion cubic meter annually is lost to evaporation and seepage. Zero, not even a drop left for the other riparian countries. So this is a reality. And the 1929 treaty has no relevance, leave alone Ethiopia, even to the former British colonies. The 1959 agreement is done between two parties, Egypt and Sudan. It's a typical bilateral treaty which has absolutely no legal significance for any other but Egypt and Sudan. So the reality in the Nile Basin stands in the air. There is no legal foundation for it.
What is your overall analysis on COVID-19 in Ethiopia from the day one up until now?
Well, so when COVID-19, the epidemic started in China, maybe once they declared at the end of December, actually as a country, we started our preparedness around the third week of January. We did not wait until Corona was detected in the country. So we established our emergency operating center and activated that emergency operating center and started screening at all the airports and borders, and started preparing for potential cases that may come in terms of facility readiness, training, and so on. So the first few months we were intensively working on the preparedness and trying to detect and building the capacity in country, like testing, for example. Initially, as you remember, we were testing by sending to South Africa, and we started testing in country beginning of February. So by March 13 was when we detected the first case of COVID-19 in Ethiopia. And the first maybe 4 weeks or so, we are progressively seeing only cases of imported cases that were coming from out of the country, and or people who have contact with those imported cases. And then slowly we started to see some community transmission. We call it community transmission when we have no clear evidence of any contact or any travel history. So we started to see few cases in Addis, few cases in other regions, and maybe around it was around May that we started to see cluster of many cases of community transmission, especially in Addis. So progressively we have seen that at least in all of our regions we see some degree of cases, although very small in number in other regions outside of Addis. We see some degree of cases of community transmission, but to see, we have seen definite cluster of community transmission. What we have identified is in Addis, that we definitely have community transmission in Addis, but for others there are sporadic cases of community transmission, mostly are related to those who come through the different borders of the country. So while we're doing this, of course, we in parallel have been building the capacity of how to manage the cases. The detection is one. For any outbreak, the main strategy is to detect early and to contain as much as possible. So for the detection, building the capacity of our testing, we currently have around 47 labs that are testing all over the country with maximum capacity of testing of around 11,000 now. Of course, our actual testing has also grown to up to 7,000, 7,400 the past few weeks. And our aim is to continue growing this capacity to at least up to 14,000, 15,000 per day and manage to test as much so that we can really know the status of the epidemic, because our testing determines how much we know about the status of the epidemic. It also determines to help us contain the transmission as well. So at the same time, we also have been expanding COVID treatment and isolation quarantine centers all over the country. And as you know, the main critical piece of our response has been the coordination, the multi-sectoral coordination and the high-level coordination. So as a part of the response around late February, our Prime Minister established the National Ministerial Committee to lead this overall response, because any such epidemic or pandemic cannot be coordinated by the health sector alone. It requires a whole of government response. So that's what we immediately did as a country. And several subcommittees led by different sectors, ministers, were established to ensure that we have all the resource mobilization, the communication, and all pieces coordinated strongly. And at the same time, also our government also, in addition to preparing the health aspect, the lab, the hospitals and so on, the immediate response or action on instituting non-pharmaceutical interventions like closing of schools, prohibiting mass gatherings and so on. These were quickly intervened as soon as we detected the first case, in few days after the detection of first cases. And this has contributed, has played a huge role in terms of minimizing the spread of the disease in the country. And this also continued until we also had the state of emergency announced, which made these interventions much stronger. But at the same time also, the response was not only the government. The whole community has also responded in terms of supporting the vulnerable population, in terms of volunteering to educate the community through media or through different campaigns. So it was, and also the private sector, other actors also have reacted by contributing either financially or giving facilities for isolation centers or supporting the vulnerable population through food support and others. So there was a strong solidarity that was seen in terms of the response, which has contributed to the strength of our country's response.
Okay, do you think Corona is not gone out of hand in Ethiopia?
At where we are now, where we are seeing it now, as I said earlier, what we know now is how much, based on how much we have been testing, but based on what we see now, the number of cases have not gone as high as it was initially predicted by WHO or others as a continent. And of course, since we are not testing the whole country, so we can only know as much as what we have tested. But what also shows us the severity of the spread of the disease is the amount of days or severe cases you also have. And we have been trying to triangulate the number of days. We may be definitely, as a country which does not have a strong days registration system, we definitely may be missing some days. But We also try to triangulate by doing some survey in Addis and around Addis to see in funeral sites, in elders, if the number of cases is really increasing from previous years. But we haven't seen that much a difference, which tells us that we are not at least missing people who are dying from COVID exponentially. So where we are now is not what we can say it has gone out of hand, but what we do after this also will determine how strong we will continue. So our response, both by the community, the precaution measures that every individual takes, and the responses stronger, keeping the response stronger, will determine also how the epidemic will continue.
Okay, Doctor, in the same token, can't we say COVID is not spread out to the community level?
Well, yes, as I said earlier, definitely there is a community spread within Addis, which we have already documented. And I've said in many of our regions we have seen some sporadic cases of community spread, but mostly not a big cluster of community spread in the different regions. But our testing has been largely, from the more than 300,000 tests we have done, it has been largely the tests predominantly in Addis and around Addis. So the testing in the different regions has to increase, and that's what we are working on now. We have now built the testing capacity, so we need to aggressively increase our testing in all our regions to make sure to say whether we have a community spread or not as a country. Usually community spread does not equally happen in everywhere. It mostly happens usually you get epicenters in big cities because of the nature of how we live. So it's obvious why we have seen it in Addis, but that doesn't mean there is no community spread in other regions. So we need to work on further to ensure what is the status of the community spread in all the regions.
To be fair to Amnesty, they gave a bit of a background to Ethiopia's current socio-political situation. But I have to say that probably that background is very scant. Is not an adequate background of the socio-political complexity of the country. You can't capture that complexity in one-page background briefing. So it's very important that you give a proper context of the current political situation of the country, the transition nature of the current political context, as well as the complexity of human rights abuses in Ethiopia, whether from armed groups that are fighting the government, or the complexity of the human rights violation that emanate in the context of an intercommunal conflict. You cannot deny human rights abuses that happen in a context of a law enforcement operation, which has been the focus of Amnesty's report in this case, and it's important that we pay attention to human rights abuses by security forces, but at the same time, you need to put this in context to be fair and balanced in your assessment of the situation.
Okay, the report is being criticized by different bodies, as you've said a while ago, different medias and different political parties, as well as the government itself is not willing to accept the full report as it is. There is a kind of understatement or either overstatement. What is your rate in that context?
I think it is important to take the finding as supported by evidence very seriously. The report uncovers alleged killings, extrajudicial executions, displacement, destruction of property, and some of the incidents that are related in the report are quite shocking. So I think for all of us, including the concerned government officers,
you cannot fail to take this seriously, you know, particularly when these findings come from a credible international human rights organization. I think the first thing is to take these findings seriously, to be concerned about it, and to demonstrate the political will and commitment for a genuine, independent, impartial, full, comprehensive investigation of what has happened. So in that sense, I'm encouraged by the response from the Office of the Attorney General, expressing the commitment for an independent and comprehensive investigation. So that is a proper response, but like I said, I think, you know, it is also right to acknowledge the criticism from human rights observers, analysts, academicians, political groups on how the Amnesty recent report failed to capture the context, and how it's you know, it's been a little insensitive in terms of looking at the political context of Ethiopia's current transition. And that criticism, which is arguably a legitimate criticism, starts from even the cover page, you know. So there is a political tone to that. So it's very important that international human rights organizations need to establish their fairness, neutrality and impartiality, not only in their rigorous fact findings, but on how you frame and present your findings as well. Otherwise, you risk to be sort of tone deaf to the political context. So in that sense, I totally acknowledge that there are legitimate criticisms and questions to be raised on how the report was framed and presented in a way that it failed to give adequate context to the alleged human rights abuses.
Okay, what are those legitimate criticisms?
Like I was saying, it is basically doing a full appraisal of the political context. That Ethiopia is a country in transition, that the current administration has demonstrated a quality of political will and commitment to break from its past record of human rights abuses, and this is evidenced by a number of positive measures current administration has taken. But at the same time, it's a transition that's faced with a complicated challenge, including a history of security forces operation not fully complying with international human rights standards, and in the context that the security forces are battling with armed groups, that the reality that the law enforcement operation possibly must have crossed its line and did harm to civilians, but that by no means is a systematic, deliberate policy of a government to harm citizens. You know, if this is presented as a systematic policy of government against its own citizens, you fail to capture the context and the complexity of the problem. It's not like government is pursuing a policy of attacking its own citizens or people in the